we are welcoming Dr. Kari Neely, who is an Associate Professor of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies here at Middle Tennessee State University. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan in Near Eastern Studies, and she also holds a master's degree from the University of Michigan. She also has a BA and an MA from the University of Arkansas. At MTSU, Dr. Neely teaches Arabic language and literature courses in the Middle Eastern Studies program, including Women in the Middle East and Graphic Novels of the Middle East, as well as courses in the Humanities Minor program. In 2010, she was foundational in earning a Access and Diversity grant to bolster Kurdish studies at MTSU. Dr. Neely has published work on Kurdish ethnic identity in Turkey, Armenian repatriation, and graphic novels Palestine by Joe Sacco. Currently, she is writing about Armenian-operated productions and female representation in graphic novels and comic books. Though the scope of her research is broad, minority identities connected to the Middle Eastern region underpins all her work. Some of her recent publications include Grandfather's Secular Tales of Hijra and Hajj in the journal South Atlantic Review, and Mehdi Zana and the Struggle for Kurdish Ethnic Identity in Turkey in an edited volume on prison narratives that I believe began as a lecture in this series a few years back. Because my own area of teaching is religious studies, I have known a number of students over the years who have worked closely with Dr. Neely studying Arabic language and literature. And I think that it's safe to say that even in an institution like MTSU, where we place a huge amount of emphasis on teaching and student engagement, Dr. Neely is an exceptional teacher and mentor. It's been an honor to work with her on various projects over the years, and I am so thrilled that she is here with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Neely.
Thank you. I really appreciate that introduction. And now I'm just trying to make it where I can see, well, it's not going to matter in a minute. But thank you so much, Dr. King, for that. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the invitation to be a part of this series. So today I am going to be presenting on, let me bring my shared screen up here for you guys and get in presentation mode. So I'll be talking to you about the amplification through simplification, understanding American pop culture through comics. And so I assume that, and maybe wrongly so, that most of these presentations previously have talked about definitions of icon. And icon in comics, well, you couldn't really have comics without icons. We define comic or icons as any image used to represent a person, place, or thing, and that is a definition that we get from Scott McCloud in a work called Understanding Comics. So comics use icons extensively. We also use symbols. Symbols are a subcategory of icons in comics, and they represent concepts, ideas, and philosophies. Comics is literally nothing more than a series of icons laid out in such a way that create a narrative. It's important that within the field, we have people understand that this definition is pretty inclusive. So this, for example, this IKEA instructional manual, we would also consider comics, even though it doesn't have words. It's still narrative using pictorial representation. We also use, we could use photographs to create comics like we see here. And when we do that, we still use word balloons and text boxes and other conventions of comics to still have this kind of narrative sequencing. Now you might ask, since we could have the opportunity to use photographs, why don't we do that? Why do we have so many comics that are drawn in such a cartoony way? And I would say that that's a good question, and that Scott McCloud provides us with some answers here. If you look at this particular slide, if you look on the left-hand side, that would be what we consider realism, and then moving down the spectrum to the right-hand side, we would consider that iconic representation. And what we do here is basically it turns out that all of us are a little bit narcissistic, and we like to read stories that are about us and that we can relate to. And the more we move down on that iconic scale from realism to representation, the more inclusive it becomes, the more of us that can actually identify with the characters that we see. This goes a little bit further in manga, Japanese manga, and this tradition that I'm about to talk about has been picked up by some American and European creators as well. So this is a technique called masking. This is from a series called Goodnight Pun Pun, where the main character is the character on the right, which is a bird. Which is interesting because I don't really like birds, but I'm interested in this comic. But the idea of masking is that we have a very iconic representation in our main character, like this stripped down version of a bird, and everything else around it is more realistic. And so it's like we're entering into this world through the mask of this simplified iconic character. Okay, so not only can we identify with the mask of these characters, but some of them we might think when we think about comics, and our general perception of comics is usually about superheroes, but all that superhero stuff is not very relatable for the average person. And I would agree. However, if I show you these silhouettes of American superheroes, most of you, I'm guessing, can identify one or more of them. Maybe I'm wrong, but most of you probably know that that's the Hulk on the right and that's Captain America on the left. Similarly, if I show you these two silhouettes, you probably know that that's Iron Man on the left and that is Black Panther, or one of the various cat-like, superheroes that we have, but that's Black Panther on the right. And it goes much further that we can strip it down even to colors and symbols. So on that top line, you probably know that that is Captain America, and then the bottom one would be, of course, Batman. This color coding and symbols that we use for superheroes in comics is actually a product of poor color technology that we had in America in the early years of comics. European comics had better color technology and don't really have the same kind of iconic color categorizing that we see in American comics. And just for fun, you know that those colors, if they're on the top, are Joker, and the ones on the bottom would be, of course, Spider-Man. And then we can strip it down to just symbolic representations where most people would know, I think even most universally, that is Superman, that is Captain America. And if you're driving around Murfreesboro, you see a lot of these stickers on the backs of trucks, and that would be Punisher. So I'm assuming that in my crowd today, some of you do not read comics, but probably were able to follow that iconic, those icons in the iconic representation. How and why then do you know these? Why do we know these figures? Well, comics are, we can call them URTEXTs, and they spin off a lot of paratext. So while you haven't read or consumed the URTEXT, in this case meaning the original source material, the comic books, the paratexts which circulate around the URTEXT include cartoons, TV shows, movies, and merch that you see that are far removed from the URTEXT. And I'll talk about some more examples of those later. The URTEXT created, or in terms of comics, the URTEXT of comics create these simplified characters that are easily identifiable, escapist in their power to triumph over evil, and easily endowed with cultural symbols and meanings to be used in other contexts in these paratextual texts that we read, especially on the internet. But I also contend that the layouts of comics, these URTEXTs, also make them more relatable, more engaging than other mediums, and help them become more ubiquitous in American society. And how does this work? So these are just examples of panels laid out on what could be a comic page. And the way that we lay out these panels have a tremendous impact on the way that you perceive space and time. I can't really get into a lot of it today. The longer the panel, the longer the duration of time. These panels themselves are discrete icons that tell us about particular moments in time. And when we remove the panel boundaries, that also holds time in abeyance. It's really fascinating. And my students in media arts really enjoy the ability to manipulate their screen size, twisting it and turning it in different ways. So after we get these ideas of the panels and layouts, I need you to know that we use pictures and words, not only just to describe and narrate what's happening in the panels, but they are used in interrelationship with one another. They're interdependent. And so I couldn't really read either one of these panels, just the words or the pictures alone, without getting their full meaning. Of course, the one on the right is a meme that I've stolen, but it really works to explain how the words and pictures work in interdependence. So then we take those pictures and panels and we populate them within the layouts that you've seen previously. And here I've just chosen Superman, and a classic Superman comic and a Wonder Woman comic. And this is where things get really interesting for me. I don't know if it'll get interesting for you. We'll see. So the very structure of comics calls into attention the lacunae in the text. And they're actually built into the story. And I'm sure that makes some of you say, what's a lacuna? It's just a gap or a hole or a lapse. And all stories have them, some more than others. They're in our sacred text, they're in our law. And this is one of the main reasons that we're interested in commentary and sermons and khutbahs and tafsir and midrash and legal theories and all of these things. And so it would seem weird to some of you, but the gaps are actually, these lacuna and lacunae are what I really find interesting about storytelling. Why? Well, it's because it's where I write some of the story. Right? It's where I'm literally being invited into the text to create my own sense of the story, make sense of it. I'm filling in the details with my own world. And so comics as a medium is one of the few mediums that I'm aware of that actually advertises these gaps. It's part of the structure. When we put the panels together, it creates what we call gutters. And the whole point of the gutter is that you make sense of what happens in between those spaces, those panels. Sometimes it's just a shift of camera angles. Sometimes it's moving our characters across space and time. And sometimes it's making us more complicit, in fact, in something such as, well, murder. Here, in a classic example from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, he discusses how the comics creator has made us the murderer in the gutter between the panels. And this making sense of things is what we call closure in comic studies. It turns out we humans love making sense of things, sometimes to our detriment. I'd love to be able to turn off my subtext detector, but in too many years in academia makes it almost impossible. So we become active creators in the gutters of comics. Obviously, there are lacunae in film and TV shows, but I think the difference is that here we're actually aware of them, where in the other medium, they're trying to downplay them. So cool, now what? We've got all this background with comics and how they work as a medium, but what can we do with it, right? Well, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about national superheroes, because that seems to be something that's relatable to our common everyday experience, especially at this time of the, well, where we are today in America. So national superheroes don't have to be a bad thing. In fact, this is the stuff that made me really start studying comics. But we need to face up to some facts before we get into what we're about to see. One, sure, comics can be a load of crap and horrible and misogynistic and racist and homophobic and xenophobic and all the worst things that you can think of, right? Absolutely, this is true. But two, that is a reflection of the societies in which they were created in their time. Popular culture in ways that other forms of art don't reflect back society to us. And in this way, because we have talked about the URTEXTS and the PARATEXTS, we're talking about a large volume of text over a really large swath of history from the 1930s to the present. And some of those are continuous stories. So it's important that we look at them. There's a really good way of seeing this evolution over time. Also, comic creators are in relationship with their readership in ways that other artists aren't. The convention culture is very well, I don't know, omnipresent in people. I mean, myself, I go to cons, okay, and I talk to creators. So national heroes, what does that mean? Well, basically take your colors of your flag and wrap it around your superhero. I picked that middle one for you, Dr. King. And maybe just put the flag up for, as their costume, and you've got yourself a hero that is going to basically stand in as a symbol for your nation. You might find it interesting too that these superheroes, national superheroes, are often created by American companies for export to the rest of the world. The one on the left being the group Alpha Force, which was created as a backstory for Marvel's X-Men character Wolverine, Logan, a Canadian citizen, again, Dr. King, from Alberta. And that's Captain Britain on the right, who uses different kinds of mythology, Merlin and such, from the British tradition. it is sometimes easier to talk about things further removed from your perspective. So I thought I'd bring you another nationalist superhero from Israel. This is Sabra Man. The Sabra is the prickly pear cactus found in Israel and Palestine, and has often been associated with the Israeli state building project. Statecraft requires the construction of a national myth, a national history, and a national character. Here, just literally a character. Sabra Man is a great example of the ethos of a nation being subsumed within a superhero, one person, right? Quote, he has the courage of Sabra and the faith of Abraham, end quote. And this comic came into existence in 1978. It was created by a 15-year-old Israeli. And the backstory of Sabra Man tells us a lot about Israel in the 1970s. So Sabra Man was created by a super agency of Israel in 1975. And this is the really interesting part. How did you get him? How did he become this superhero? By implanting atomic rods into the body of Dan Baron, a Holocaust survivor who had served in the 1956, 1967, and 1973 wars. You'd imagine that he would probably enjoy fighting Nazis too, which he does. And while not hugely popular, which I can't imagine with this wonderful comic stylings that you see before you here, the construction of this character still tells us a lot about the monomyth of Israel, and it specifically tells us a lot about the fears of Israel at that time. This in the 1970s is when Israel is thought to have obtained atomic and nuclear power, and the idea of generating a magnetic field to protect him and others is definitely fits within an Israeli narrative. Now, the next section that I want to talk to you about is Captain America, and I think I skipped one. Yeah, Captain America and American Monomyth-Making. So my plan is to walk you through some major events in Captain America's life, Stephen Rogers. And as a lot of you who maybe read comics are aware of, the multiverse is vast and is ever changing. And so I hope that most of this falls within what you know. America, like Israel, has its own ethos, its values, and its history. And the monomyth of America is steeped in rebellion, manifest destiny, and American exceptionalism. And two scholars have written a book called The American Monomyth. That's, I'm going to probably mispronounce the name, and I apologize for that. So it's Jouad and Lawrence. They came up with the following definition of the American monomyth, which they've used to read popular American culture. And this, I'll tell you before I get started here, I'm terrified of pronouncing one of these words, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce it in front of you all, and I feel bad because it's an honors lecture series, but I'm going to read it to you, and just hopefully I'll get through it. So a community and a harmonious paradise is threatened by evil. And this next line is very important to my the rest of my talk. Normal institutions fail to contend with this threat. A selfless hero emerges to renounce temptations and to carry out the redemptive task. Aided by fate, his decisive victory restores the community to its paradisiacal, let's see, there's the word, paradise condition, and the superhero then recedes into obscurity. The receding into obscurity is very important. Unlike the Joseph Campbell myth, where the superhero goes back to his community and is integrated into the community, the American superhero continues on into the next journey, into the next battle. So, obviously, going into Captain America's timeline in 1941, 9 months prior to the United States entering into World War II, Captain America has his first cover, and he's, of course, punching Hitler. This is pretty iconic. Most people have seen this image, or at least some kind of interpretation of it. And the interesting thing is that while, you know, punching Nazis has been a staple of American politics for some time, the punching Nazis in this particular cover was controversial at the time. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who were the originators of the Captain Marvel series, were opposed to the war and thought that the United States should enter it, and they created Captain America here, to express their position visually. This, so I've already told you that is one of the most iconic. So then, Captain America goes on to continue his battles in World War II throughout the 1940s. And then in the 1950s, I don't know if you can see that, I'm sure that you can see the title, Captain America throughout the 1950s becomes the commie smasher, right? And of course, that coincides with McCarthy era Red Scare, and maybe McCarthy was reading Cap, I don't know, but there seems to be some overlap. So to this point, it's easy to see the application of that American monomyth with the heroes working outside of these American agencies, but still in tandem with them. And you might think then that these superheroes, and this is a quote, exist to symbolize the notion that might equals right, that a select few should dictate the fate of the world, and that the status quo is to be protected at all costs. This is a quote from Glenn Weldon from an article from NPR entitled Superheroes and the F Word, Grappling, and it should be word, not world, grappling with the ugly truth under the cape, and the F word here is fascism. So Glenn in the article goes on to state, quote, Superman, Batman, and other costume heroes found themselves conscripted alongside Captain America, not to fight the Axis themselves, and that's emphasized, but mind you, but to root out stateside saboteurs and urge readers to plant victory gardens and buy war bonds, end quote. Truth, justice, and the American way became mottos of our heroes. Many of our heroes, though, he points out, have origin stories that were engineered to, well, where they are engineered to be superior to everyone else. And in fact, Captain America has a superhero serum who makes him into a super soldier, right? Or these heroes belong to a superior alien race, see Superman. And that's kind of interesting in the backdrop of World War II. So some would say, and Weldon does, that this is exceedingly problematic, and they have become tried in different ways to resolve these issues over time. Weldon goes on to suggest that we are at this time, especially 40s and 50s, we're fighting fascists with fascists, or at least fascist ideals. So moving into the 1950s and early 1960s, of course, the backdrop is Vietnam and the Comics Code Authority, and then some of you might not have heard of that. But so during the 1950s, McCarthy goes on to conduct those Senate hearings, trying to root out communists. And at the same time, comics were also getting their own Senate hearings to determine whether or not there was a link between comics and juvenile delinquency. The outcomes of these hearings, where the main witness was I think a psychologist named Wortham, he declared that comics were worse than Hitler, that comics went further than Hitler did. And the Senate hearing led to the self-regulation of the comics industry through what is known as the Comics Code Authority. So they self-regulated as an industry rather than have the government come in and start, setting up different standards that they had to go by. So during this 50 to 20 year period, good had to conquer evil, or you wouldn't get the seal. And all of our heroes were squeaky clean and cis heteronormative and white. Where we had Black heroes before, they were suddenly whitewashed. So Cap basically gets frozen for a decade in the mid 1950s. He's put on ice quite literally. When Cap gets defrosted in 1964, we start getting the backstories that if you watch the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And nothing really happens in the late 1950s, early 1960s, because comics are on lockdown. They're being self-regulated. Vietnam isn't really addressed in Captain America, which seems odd, but how could they win here? If Cap sided with the United States, you lose half your audience. If Cap sides, thinks that the war is wrong, then you lose half of your audience. And in fact, in Marvel time, he's still on ice. In Marvel universe, the multiverse, he's still on ice throughout this. Later on, in a Spider-Man comic, I think from the 1990s, he comes out in favor and support of the downtrodden Vietnamese people, which makes sense. So in the 1960s, we see this really important shift in the way that we construct superheroes. And this was due to a lack of readership. People were not reading as many comics, probably because of the Comics Code Authority, I'd have to say. But Stanley decides that one of the ways that we can reshape superheroes is to make them more relatable. right? Well, I've already told you they're fairly relatable, but now how can we make them even more relatable? And so he comes up with Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and of course, this is the Peter Parker principle that Uncle Ben is purported to have said to Peter. But Spider-Man was also created to be a youth hero, to be full of angst, to be unsure of himself, to make mistakes, but also to have enormous power. And so he was supposed to be more relatable for a younger readership. Likewise, once Stephen Rogers becomes unfrozen, he too gains a new audience. But as he regains his memories, he has many regrets, and he really specifically regrets the death of his sidekick Bucky, and feels that he was complicit in that death. And so we move from this kind of classical hero that's infallible to these more relatable heroes with flaws, right? Iron Man himself, though, he's basically just fighting new superheroes. So he's fighting Iron Man and Black Panther. The 1970s and 1980s, things change, but maybe the way more things change, the more they stay the same. And we're going to see here that there's a bigger emphasis on Captain America having issues with American institutions. So why would that be? Well, in the 1970s and 1980s, we have the Nixon administration. We have the continuation of the Vietnam War. As we move into the 80s, we've got American imperialism under Reagan. And while you might take issue with that, let me just remind you of Grenada, the Falkland War, the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon, the Iran-Iraq War, which we were involved in, Iran-Contra, we were in Afghanistan, and not to mention the war on drugs. So Cap had some issues with all of these things going on in American institutions that were allowing these things to happen. So he walks away a number of times from his position as Captain America. He does it first under the Nixon administration in a plot line that mirrors what happened with the Nixon administration. He walks away again under Reagan when Reagan tries to get him to be an agent of the state. And again, this all is emphasizing Captain America representing the American people instead of the institutions of the state. So here are some examples of these walking away or his critiques on American institutions. This is a sequence taken from a 1980s comic where Captain America has been asked to run for president. Gee, I wonder why in 1980 that they might be critiquing the idea of celebrity as president, but he declines it and says that that's not appropriate, right? Here under Reagan, he's asked to become a part of the institutions of the government. And if you can read there, that last panel, I am loyal to nothing, General, except the dream, the American dream. It's interesting too that in the 1980s, he's really involved in a big battle with a villain called Flag Smasher. And as I was doing research for this presentation, I had forgotten how much the 80s was devoted to talking about the desecration of flags. But I digress. Here's another panel from a sequence from, I think, the 2019. If you look at the last panel here, General, I honor your service too, and I'll stand down when Washington decides to stand up. Another critique on American institutions. So what I'm trying to get to in a speedy fashion is something that most of you know from a paratextual source from the MCU, which is Civil War, right? So I'm assuming that some of you have seen Captain America Civil War. And what is really interesting here, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want, is that depending on, first of all, let me tell you when this was written. The actual text, the URTEXTs date back to 2006 and 2007. It's a 7-series run. It's a crossover storyline. So characters coming in from all different series lines. And in the paratextual release, in Captain America Civil War, it's 2016. These dates are important for you to understand the historical context in which these texts are created. So in this crossover narrative, depending on your perspective and how you read into those gaps, you can either see it as a critique of the US Patriot Act, which asks Americans to give up some civil liberties in exchange for security, Or going back to this kind of monomyth that we've constructed, other people have suggested, especially looking at the years that it was written, that perhaps Cap's refusal to register as a superhero and therefore come underneath a government agency, being told what to do and when and what, under what circumstances. Perhaps this is actually a critique of America in their war with Iraq, and the critique of the international community through the UN and the ICC and other international institutions that tried to bring America into some kind of, to basically control our actions. So people see it two ways. Some people are pro Team Iron Man. Some people are pro Captain America. So it just kind of, it depends. I will say before I get to this last slide that in 2010, Cap retires, and that has other implications, but just focusing on Stephen Rogers, he becomes involved in Black Ops operations. But I'm just going to leave that aside for now. We can talk more about that if you'd like. So from what I've told you, from the 1970s onward, with notable exceptions during times of war, 9/11, under specific creators, Frank Miller and others, comics have taken this American exceptionalism, this lack of integration into society, this rebellious nature, to critique American institutions, leaders, and foreign policies. And then I'm going to show you this last example, which is a paratextual interpretation of The Boys, that is currently running on Amazon Prime, which I do recommend, even though it's got some scenes in it you might not find too palatable. But so taken to their logical conclusions, if you look back to our American heroes from the 1940s and 1950s, you might end up thinking of, if they hadn't made this shift in the 1960s and 70s, you might end up with a figure, a superhero, a nationalist superhero like Homelander here. And Homelander, I mean, he's wearing the American flag as a cape. There's no doubt that he is supposed to be a symbol of America. And Homelander's backstory is that he was bioengineered by a corporation, and that makes him beholden to that corporation. That corporation is into the military industrial complex. It controls most of the United States GDP, and they're using superheroes as agents of war and to protect us from terrorists, super terrorists, which is a whole line that they go into, to protect Americans. And so that other figure there standing in front of him is Stormfront, who is, yes, a literal Nazi, not a neo-Nazi, but she has been around since the 1930s, and she and Homelander get involved in a relationship with one another. This is clearly a critique of contemporary American politics, but what is interesting and that I really want to point out to you is that these superheroes, as a part of government institutions now, not existing external to them, right, which goes against the American monomyth, as we've set up, these superheroes are brought in line or checked, not by other superheroes, no, but by ordinary people who outmaneuver them, expose them, and pit them against one another. So we've switched places. Our heroes have switched places. They are now the institutions. They are corporate America, and we, the people, are emboldened to bring them down. So in my final thoughts here, comics are evolving, they are changing, they're a reflection of us, they're self-reflexive, and they use these kinds of ideas to continually critique and evolve. And they're, I guess, iconic. I guess that's my final take on it. So I'll stop there. Oh, no, I do have a couple more things. Suggested further readings, yeah. And I put these here so I could copy and paste them into the chat for you. Anything by Salahuddin Ahmed, I highly encourage you to read. How Censors Killed the Weird Experimental Progressive Golden Age of Comics is great. Understanding the racism implicit in the comics code is something I assigned in my class, and how the code authority kept LGBT characters out of comics are great reads for you to understand the impact of the comics code on superhero creation. Books that I just like. Captain America and the Nationalist Superhero, Metaphors, Narratives, and Geopolitics. I obviously took some from inspiration with Jason Dittmer. Palestine, you've already know that I love it because I've written about it. Bitch Planet, I also highly encourage you to check that out if you're into feminist readings of superheroes. Abbott by Salah ad-Din, which is set in Detroit, is great. And basically my syllabus, if you are interested in it, I would be happy to give it to you so you can get your any books that you might be interested in. And if you don't have time to like ask me about that, then you can always email me and I'm happy to point you in directions that might be fruitful for you. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neely. That was very exciting. And I feel like I have a better understanding of some of my American friends who kind of came of age in the 80s and the 90s. So thank you for that as well. Please join me in thanking Dr. Neely for this presentation. It was engaging and we all walked away with a list of things to check out over winter break when we all have free time, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.